There we go. Recording in progress. If I could also just say, as I think I've said in the last meeting, if you want to ask a question, of course, we encourage that. Don't rely on the chat function because I may not see it. If you could just stick your virtual hand up and I'll hopefully get to you. So actually, tonight we've got a couple of speakers. We'll finish by 7:15 and I'll go straight to our first speaker, and that's Clare Linton. Clare's a policy and research advisor from the Urban Transport Group. She's going to be talking about delivering a greener future, the decarbonisation of freight and logistics, which I think should be very interesting because that's not really an area we've covered before. And of course, at the end of all this, we'll hopefully be producing a report sometime over the summer. So over to you, Clare.
Great, thanks very much. And I'll just share my screen so you can see my slides. So just give me a second. Right, is that okay? Yeah,
that's
great,
fine.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. So I'll be talking about delivering a greener future, decarbonisation of freight and logistics. This is largely based on a report we put out with the same title in January, which focuses primarily on city regions. And I'll give a bit of background to the Urban Transport Group in a minute for context, but I think a lot of the findings are relevant. I recognise that the Scottish context, you've got a lot of deeply rural areas as well. So I think a lot of the findings are still useful in that context. And I'll also try and reflect a bit on some of the policies that are happening in Scotland as well. So yeah, I'll just give a little bit of background on the Urban Transport Group, just for context of kind of our perspective and where we're coming from, because I think it's useful. So we are a membership network of transport authorities. We represent the 7 largest city regions in England who are coming up there. We also have, so there are full members. We also have some associate members in some other cities, regions, and some of the devolved nations as well. Since this slide template was put together, we now also have TransLink in Northern Ireland and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority as well. So on behalf of our members, we do 3 kind of main things. The first is thought leadership, so producing research reports on a whole range of topics related to urban transport. So you can see some here. And like I say, our work on freight and logistics is part of this kind of thought leadership work. The second is what we call making the case. That's kind of advocating for funding and powers for our members to invest in transport infrastructure and services in the regions that they serve. So that might include things like attending political party conferences, meeting with senior leaders and decision makers to advocate for that, for our members' interests. And then the third thing that we do is professional networks. So we have a lot of different groups that bring together officers from our members to share knowledge and best practice. And we have groups on everything from kind of bus operations through to active travel, freight and logistics, HR, legal, like kind of a really broad spectrum of groups. And over the last 2 years, a lot of our work has focused on supporting our members with managing the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that's had on our transport systems. So we're kind of now returning to more of our normal day-to-day work. But yeah, it's been an interesting 2 years for our members and consequently for kind of our work as well. So just a bit of background, a bit of an overview on what I'm going to cover on kind of freight and logistics and decarbonisation. So I'll give a little bit of background of like kind of why freight and logistics are so important to our economy and the transport system. I'll talk a bit about some of the benefits and challenges associated with freight. And like I say, because of our membership, our focus is on kind of city regions, but the findings are super useful and relevant, I think, across different geographies. I'll then talk about the journey to urban areas and the way we split it up. I say the journey to urban areas, but that in a sense is the long bit of the journey and the bit that is most often in a truck or on a freight train. So thinking about the journey to the destination, then what happens to goods when they get there in terms of distribution and consolidation. And then there's the last mile bit, which is kind of that very last bit of the delivery. And we think about that in 4 ways around making that green, safe, smart, and unobtrusive. And then I'll just bring it together at the end. So A little bit of background. So the freight and logistics sectors are really kind of the backbone of our economy. They have a huge economic contribution, which I'll come to in kind of some of the benefits on the next slide. But, you know, at the moment, 79% of our freight in Great Britain travels by road. And obviously that has a lot of challenges associated with it. City regions are often the ultimate destination for goods, but obviously not always, and how they reach that destination can have significant impacts on kind of the people and environment of those areas. And I'll go into some more of those challenges now. So as I say, the freight and logistics sectors really do underpin the economy, and I think that's really come to light over the last 2 years. We've really kind of changed our perspective on the freight and logistics sectors and really see them as kind of, I don't know, we kind of reframe them as key workers and really could see how important they were through the pandemic and in terms of keeping our economy moving. And it's a huge employer as well. It employs 2.5 million people in the UK, which is huge. It's one of the biggest sectors. That isn't a very diverse workforce and is something that we need to kind of do more to address. And it's actually a really aging workforce as well, which represents challenges as we see kind of that workforce moving through, and attracting younger people into the sector is really challenging. And there's been a lot of work around apprenticeships and trying to bring people in, but it is a really challenging sector to recruit to. So that's one of the challenges. I think in terms of kind of freight in our urban areas, but I guess in anywhere where people are living, it's causing challenges around congestion and road safety. We know that goods vehicles are involved in a disproportionate number of accidents compared to how many kilometres they do on the roads, and obviously that's to do with vehicle design as well. Both air pollution and carbon emissions are associated with our freight transport. Road and track maintenance. So these vehicles are very heavy and big and have a big impact on our infrastructure. Noise and vibration, talk a little bit about that later, about how we can minimize the impacts on kind of local residents and things like that. And then just kind of the impacts on quality of life and urban around, having large numbers of goods vehicles moving around. And, you know, we've seen huge increases in van traffic over the last 20 years and kind of what impact that has on our kind of our places. So what we kind of argue for throughout kind of the report that goes with this work is that we need to find ways to maximise the benefits of freight and the economic contribution it brings and all the employment it brings, and, you know, the convenience and everything like that, while finding ways to kind of minimise some of these more negative impacts that we see. So when we're thinking about, like I say, the journey to the urban areas, but really this is the long bit of any freight journey. What we argue for is that every opportunity should be taken for freight to travel by rail and water. So the rail freight sector is already a big sector. It, you know, contributes £1.7 billion of economic benefits to the UK and transports £30 billion worth of goods. So it's already pretty big, but I think it could do more, and we need to kind of create the environment where it can do more, because, you know, the graphic shows that, you know, every freight train is taking 76 HGVs off the road, and that's having benefits for all those challenges we outlined on the previous slide around congestion, road safety, air pollution, carbon emissions, all of those things it can help to benefit. Water can be a bit more tricky because not every area has the facilities to support water freight, but there are obviously opportunities for that. And it's sort of in England, like Leeds has done quite a lot around kind of developing the canal system to support kind of freight deliveries and developing wharfs and things. And yeah, so it's like looking for those opportunities where they exist and trying to make the most of them. And I think there are kind of examples in other countries where places have kind of developed a lot more of their water freight facilities. I think there's an example in an old version of this report. I don't think it made it into the new one of the beer boat in Amsterdam, where the boat travels around the different bars delivering the beers to the bars, but obviously they have the facilities there. But it's kind of identifying those opportunities and making the changes where possible. And I'll talk a bit more about rail freight and some of the examples that come up later as well. So distribution and consolidation, this is really thinking about what happens to the goods when they arrive in the city region. So this could be thinking about using things like parcel lockers, and the example in the picture there is actually on Transport for London Land. So, you know, trying to make the use of these facilities where people are already going. So you're not adding an extra journey in. you might just pick your parcel up on your way home from work when you get off the train, or putting them at the supermarkets. You quite often see lockers at supermarkets now, those kind of things. So taking those opportunities to kind of reduce the number of trips potentially. Consolidation centers are often kind of proposed as an innovative way to kind of reduce the number of trips being made, and these things can also be linked with rail and water facilities too. So my favourite example in the whole report is the work that Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Trust have done in London. So they've developed a consolidation hub at Dartford along the Thames, and they started with that, and that was just kind of a road consolidation hub and was reducing the number of vehicle trips coming into central London to the hospitals. And last year they went one step further and actually developed a riverboat delivery service that brings their deliveries up from Dartford along the Thames into central London, and the very last mile is done by cargo bike. And I just think it's a really, really powerful way of showing the power of consolidation, using rail and water where available, and that last mile kind of zero emission modes as well. And the next step they're going to take is to look at procuring some electric vans and trucks, I think, for those bits that don't quite work in that way that they've got now. So they're really looking at the whole picture, and I think it's really powerful. And this is an example of kind of using rail facilities to bring deliveries right into the heart of urban areas. But again, it wouldn't need to be an urban area. It could be a town or a more kind of rural hub. But this is a converted passenger train that's carrying basically parcels, and it's been fitted out to carry these pallets and parcels. I think this is Euston, and then the last mile part is being done by cargo cycles. So you're getting things in as far as you can into the urban core, and then you're facilitating the zero emission part for the last bit of the journey. So yeah, I think that's a really nice example of innovation. That's a trial, I think. I can't remember exactly the companies, but it's in the report, the companies that are involved in that. There's actually a few different pilot schemes going on at the moment with converting passenger trains to take parcels into urban areas. And this is just graphic that kind of shows that, really, about kind of making the use of rail and water where possible for the first part, using consolidation and innovative distribution when it arrives in the area, and then the last mile part being using zero emission modes where possible. So moving on to focus on that last mile part, and actually thinking about it, if we're thinking beyond the city regions, actually the last mile might be last several miles, especially in a rural area, but these kind of messages are still broadly the same. And the development of really good e-cargo bikes means that, even in areas that have challenging terrain or the journeys are a little bit longer, actually you can still open up opportunities for e-cargo bikes. And there's a nice example of a project in Todmorden in West Yorkshire, which is really hilly, and it's a town, but they've developed an e-cargo bike delivery system there. So I think it does transcend geography, although I recognise there are probably some very, very deeply rural areas where you're going to need motorised transport. So making the last mile green. This is kind of around focusing on reducing CO2 and air pollution from freight to meet our decarbonisation targets and improving public health. So around this is kind of supporting low, ultra low and zero emission vehicles in the freight sector. We're seeing increasing numbers of kind of smaller vans being offered in kind of electric vans. The bigger vehicles are still more challenging, and I think there's a case for needing more kind of government support around those larger vehicles and the roadmap for those. I've mentioned already cargo cycles, but they do offer a real benefit when we compare it to diesel vans. And like I said, in urban areas, they can actually be quicker often than vans because they're not stuck in traffic. And then portering, I just want to briefly mention this. This is around kind of doing more of the last mile on foot, and they talk about it actually in the last 200 metres. So there was a trial in London, I think it was Ford and G Cargo looked at this, and they delivered a transit van into central London with all the deliveries on, and then they had a team of delivery drivers who just walked from this van to deliver all these parcels. And they found it was much more efficient in terms of kind of fuel, obviously because the vans weren't driving around, but also in terms of time, because actually drivers spend a huge amount of time driving around looking for parking and then ending up walking anyway for some distance. So again, there's more details in the report of the actual kind of benefits of that, but I was really blown away by how much benefit you got from doing it with a team of people on foot rather than, 5 people in a van trying to drive around and park. And obviously the benefits for congestion and air quality and all of that are just huge. So I'll just touch briefly on the other aspects of kind of last mile delivery, because I know kind of focused on the decarbonisation traffic side of things, but these are kind of interlinked in the sustainable transport piece. So I mentioned earlier that goods vehicles are a significant cause of injury and death on urban roads, despite making up a smaller proportion of traffic. So we argued in the report that we need a broad review of the road safety regime and a commitment to world-leading standards. And the Vision Zero and Safe System approach is one example of the kind of standards that you could introduce. And the Westminster government have recently consulted on introducing a accident investigation branch, which would pick up on the post-crash response part of this. And it's not just for freight, but like really embedding the learning from any collisions that we have so that we can try and do better and shift away from the impacts that kind of road safety has. And then the other pillars of the safe system around vehicles, road use, the infrastructure itself, so roads and roadsides and speeds. But like I say, this is just one example of world-leading standards, but is one that we think is kind of quite simple and easy to understand and kind of brings it together quite nicely. And the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport, is that right? PACTs kind of advocate for this this Vision Zero and Safe System approach. Then making the last mile smart. So there's various examples in the report of kind of the options for using data to optimize deliveries and the impact that can have on kind of making this more efficient and reducing emissions. We may see a shift to more connected and autonomous vehicles for freight and logistics. There's issues around management of the curbside and kind of how people drop off and pick up with deliveries. And then drones. We don't talk a huge amount about drones in the report, largely because we can't see that they are going to be, prolific in dense urban areas, which is the areas we're looking at. However, thinking more about the Scottish context, they could have a real role for deliveries to really deeply rural areas and, highlands and islands and that kind of thing. So the example in the report is around a project that used drone deliveries to the Isle of Wight during the pandemic and was delivering medical supplies across the Solent. And that I think could be an interesting transferable case study to some of the more rural areas in Scotland. Yeah. And then finally, we talk about making the last mile unobtrusive, and this is about, making sure we minimise the impact in terms of noise on local residents. So, low and zero emission vehicles and cargo cycles already offer quiet alternative to conventional fossil fueled vehicles. We often talk about retiming deliveries to kind of mitigate some of the congestion impacts and those kind of things. But if we're delivering at night, we kind of need to look for these kind of new technologies to help reduce the noise from deliveries that might impact on local people. So that can include things like quiet roll cages, soft closed doors and low noise refrigeration units. So just to kind of bring it together, so we think kind of in terms of decarbonising freight and kind of delivering this greener future, we need to invest in infrastructure for modal shift. So looking at shifting from road to rail and water, and also thinking about the cargo cycles and zero emission vehicles as well. How we might incentivise that modal shift, that might be fiscal measures, projects, pilots, those kind of things. We need to green freight, so again, kind of the low and zero emission vehicles and alternatives where possible, and thinking about improving safety as well. But yeah, there's loads. That's kind of a quick canter through quite a long report. So there's loads more in the report if you want to hear more about kind of the case studies and things, and also happy to pick up questions if I can remember as well. And yeah, there's my details are on the slides as well. So if anyone wants to get in touch, then please do. Thanks.
Claire, thank you so much. Yeah, we'll go back to normal there. Remember to stick your virtual hands up if you want to ask a question. Not your actual hand, Ian, but your virtual hand. Claire, what happened to this report? Where's it gone, and what reaction has it had? I mean, do you expect to see anything coming of it?
So we published it. It had a good kind of broad reaction. We're kind of starting to take it out to conferences now as well. And it's also useful for our members. Like, obviously we work on behalf of our members, so it helps to inform their thinking around policy too. I think it's also fed into some of how we respond to some of the consultation responses. So I mentioned that consultation on road accident investigation branch. So we will take kind of the work we do and feed it into that, kind of trying to shift policy to better meet the needs of city regions.
Okay, just one more question from me, and then I'll bring other people in. Where can we see the report?
It's on our website, and I'll when I've stopped taking questions, I'll post the link to it in the chat, and then it can be there for everybody to find.
Right, fantastic. Thanks so much. I'll go to Robert Sampson and then Sarah Boyack. Robert.
Thank you, Graham. Thanks for that presentation, Claire. It was really useful. Just a quick question. I've been in several meetings with rail industry, bus industry, and yourself made a comment at the start of the presentation about the difficulty in recruiting staff and the high age profile. I'm just wondering if you have any particular thoughts on how to overcome that, because I see that as a problem throughout logistics and transport going forward.
Robert, but can you just say where you're from?
Stakeholder manager with transport focused consumer organisation representing passengers.
Thank you, Claire.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know if we were taking two at once. Yes, I think it is a problem throughout the transport sector, and actually I think we need a sector-wide approach to kind of dealing with it. And actually, again, credit to the government, they have recently consulted on transport labour market and skills. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. I mean, it's a huge challenge, and I think, you know, we probably need to do a lot more work in schools on the transport sector as a whole, because I think the sector has a real image problem. It's seen as boring. It's seen as, I don't know, not very innovative. But actually, I think, and actually, you speak to a lot of people who work in transport and they've ended up in transport by accident. Not many people leave school and think I'm going to have a career in transport. So I think we need to do a better job of kind of really showcasing the breadth of careers that are available in the transport sector, and actually that it is a really dynamic and interesting place to work. Yeah, so that's not an easy answer, and I think there's a lot to do, but I think there's I think we need a real sector-wide approach, because I think sometimes we can end up fixing one bit and causing problems in others. For example, managing the HGV driver shortage last autumn, the government wrote to everyone with a HGV driver's license and actually poached a load of bus drivers. And then, so what you've done is help with one problem over here, but then created another problem over there. So I really think we actually need to think about it in the round and think about it as a whole.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Sarah Boyack, who's a fellow member of the Parliament, and then Jane Liston.
Thanks, that was a really good presentation. And I think a lot of us have been signed up to rail freight for a long time. It's the how do you get it to be something that governments will actually just go for and press the button on it, because in terms of climate and congestion issues now, it couldn't be more pertinent. But it's the how do you make it the infrastructure priority, and what are your geographic priorities across both Scotland and the UK? Thanks.
I think you're right. It is really challenging. I think there are two things I'd reflect on. One, I think, is around the cost, and you know, road freight isn't necessarily paying for all the negative externalities it causes. It's not paying for the damage to the road infrastructure, the air quality, all of those impacts. Therefore, rail freight is at a disadvantage because of that. So there's a question there, and it's obviously a challenging question about how you balance that up. It's a tricky problem, but one I think probably we need to look at if we're going to kind of incentivize rail freight. And then I think the other thing is thinking differently about rail freight. So the example I gave around kind of delivering parcels on converted passenger trains into city centre rail stations. I think there's real potential there, particularly for kind of this next day delivery, parcel delivery market that typically isn't picked up by rail freight. You know, a lot of stuff on rail freight is either bulk or it's intermodal stuff for kind of, you know, Tesco or whatever. But if you can start to edge into different markets and different models, and you know, you don't need a huge long freight train carrying bulk, but you can convert a passenger train to deliver parcels into central Leeds tonight, then it starts to open up rail freight in a different way. So I think that they would be my two reflections around kind of leveling the playing field between road and rail and doing things differently.
Okay, thank you. Jane, followed by James Harkins.
Hello, thank you. Well, unfortunately, I'd love to have rail freight coming to St Andrews, but as we don't have a railway, that's not really possible. And Lucas railway station is 5.5 miles away. What I was wondering was how easy it is for deliveries to be timed, however they're coming. Reason being, every so often people say, let's pedestrianise the centre of St Andrews. That's fine, except there's an awful lot of shops that don't have any back entrances. And so how do they get their deliveries? And people say, well, it's easy enough. You just get them to come first thing in the morning. But if you look at a map and see where St Andrews is, it tends to be at the end of the road for deliveries, especially coming from the central belt. So you have people turning up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to make deliveries. And obviously that wouldn't work if one was going to have pedestrianisation or even pedestrian priority. So I'm just wondering how flexible are delivery firms for taking that into account?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't have the answer. Like, I don't know kind of, you know, how those specific companies would work and how they feel about it. I know that, you know, some shopping centres and areas have piloted kind of consolidation so that actually shops come together and deliveries come, you know, on fewer deliveries, which I guess in a model where you wanted the deliveries to be retimed might help. Yeah, I can see that's challenging because I live in Leeds, and Leeds is very pedestrianised. But actually, if I go into work early, there's vans everywhere because they all do their deliveries before 9. But yeah, I can see that when you're in a more rural context, that is more challenging. But I think the consolidation idea would be something that would be interesting to explore. And the examples I have are more urban. So Oxford Street have done some consolidation pilots around kind of consolidating deliveries but obviously it's very, very urban. And I think there's been a trial in Bristol as well. So yeah, I guess that would help, but yeah, I'm not confident on kind of how flexible people can be, especially with shops, because obviously you know you're opening at a specific time.
Yeah. Sorry for bullying you a googly there.
Right, Jane,
not at all.
Jane, we're going to move on. Jane, we're moving on. James Harkins, followed by Ian Budd.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Claire, a wee statement and a question, if I may. I spoke with Jonathan Bray. I've seen this report. I spoke with Jonathan. That he's have admitted to use or consider using light rail and trams. We done a study using Metrolink and roller cages, and it can be done. There is about 6 continental systems who use the tram system, including for bottle banks at night, that sort of thing. Yeah. There's also factories north-south of the town, and they have a cargo tram running freight between the two. My question is, you keep referring to it as green vehicles. If it's rubber wheels, there's no such thing because of road tyre dust. So my question is going to be, as governments fail to achieve air quality targets, they'll tighten up the legislation. How is the industry, which I belong to, how is the industry going to cope with the reduced particulates legislation? England, they've gone for 400 units. In Scotland, they're a bit more sensible. They're down to 100. But as you know, there's no safe limit.
Yeah. So just on the trams, it is yeah, it's an oversight, and I think you're right, and I think it's it does offer interesting opportunities, and we particularly like the kind of the use of the trams for waste collection, which I think is really cool. So yeah, I think exploring the options for it where possible definitely is important. On particulates from tyres, yeah, it's a big issue, and I think one which we're kind of, to a degree, just not looking at, are we? Because we're focused on carbon emissions and diesel particulates. So I don't have the answer. I mean, I guess part of the answer is using kind of rail, water, and cargo boats where we can, and and limiting the need for kind of motorized road transport as much as possible. But yeah, you are always going to have that challenge around kind of particulates from tyre and brake wear.
Okay, thanks for your question, James. I'm going to move on to Ian Budd, followed by Dave Defoe. Ian.
Yeah, sorry. Hello there. Great presentation, very interesting. A bit thought-provoking about cargo cycles in cities. Cities like Glasgow are already flooded with cyclists on the pavement, Deliveroo cyclists and various other ones. And it's becoming very difficult, especially if you've got young children with you. It's very difficult to walk down the street in Glasgow now, particularly. So my question is the Urban Transport Group involved at all in helping planning to have separate cycle roads right around city centres? Because you mentioned that the cargo cycles are great because they're not stuck in the traffic. Certainly in Glasgow, it means they're on the pavement, and it's really very dangerous. So, this is something that needs to be addressed, not just little short bits of cycle lane, but absolute a network in city centres with not going on the pavement at all.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We do loads on active travel. So we have an active travel group that supports kind of our lead officers working on active travel and kind of prioritising that investment in infrastructure and supporting them with kind of knowledge and best practice around that. So yeah, we do a lot on kind of helping our members on active travel. And I think increasingly our members want to be delivering, the kind of world-class walking and cycling infrastructure that, you want to see in our cities. I agree with you about the kind of delivery cyclists on kind of, in kind of on pavements and in pedestrianised areas. And I actually I think part of me would like to throw it back to the companies, because I think they're probably not doing, I do think they probably are maybe not doing enough around training their delivery operators on kind of where they should be and how they should behave, because I think there should be more done around that. And you see quite a lot of dangerous cycling where people are cycling the wrong way at one-way streets or going through red lights. And so I do wonder a bit about kind of the training that's provided and the safety aspects around that. But I think ultimately, if you're providing better segregated cycling infrastructure, which is ultimately what we would want, then that will help to support cargo cycle delivery as well. And that was kind of what we say in the report, that investing in world-class, high-quality walking and cycling infrastructure should help to incentivize that for freight deliveries as well.
And actually, I mean, Ian mentioned Glasgow, but Glasgow is actually doing quite well for cycling infrastructure, I would say, as is Edinburgh does quite well, but Glasgow's done quite a lot. I mean, I cycle in Glasgow. I have to say, Ian, I don't see these people cycling on pavements, but maybe I go there at different times to you. Anyway, I'll move on to someone who knows a lot about bikes, and that's Dave Defoe, okay, followed by Stuart Hay.
Thanks very much. Well, my question is not specifically on bikes, although there is a relevance, I guess. Thanks very much for your talk, Claire. The Scottish Government has got a commitment, not a target, but a commitment to reducing car kilometres 20% by the year 2030. as far as I understand it, that's just car kilometres, not vehicle kilometres. Your talk and your reports are entirely about freight and logistics. I was wondering if you see any connection such that if freight logistics are improved in some way, that can assist with the government target on car kilometre reduction, or is there no real connection? Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess there's an element of if some freight and logistics activities are taking the place of car trips. So potentially, you know, if you're getting your shopping delivered or whatever it is, you're not making that trip. So I guess there is a role for freight and logistics in supporting that car kilometre reduction target. I guess what we don't want as a result is car kilometres to come down and van kilometres to go up, because you're just kind of shifting it around. You know, there's potential that, you know, one van making a delivery to a street with all our groceries offsets 10 people driving to the supermarket, but we all know that's not necessarily how it works because everyone's ordering their shopping on different days. And I do think there's something there around kind of helping consumers to make greener choices. And maybe that's part of it, actually, that, you know, if we can help consumers to make greener choices, then we don't see car kilometres come down and van kilometres go up. So, and then I think going back to making use of rail, water, cycle, and people on foot where we can, so that brings that kind of van kilometres down. So yeah, I don't know if that's kind of picking up on what you were thinking, but I think, yeah, I guess what you don't want is car kilometres to come down and everything to just go up, everything else to go up in an unsustainable way as a result.
Thank you.
Stuart, you did have your hand up.
Yeah, Stuart here from Living Streets. I'm just flagging, I've put in the chat a link to a Scottish Government document on this topic. It's from 2018 that covers the same sort of ground. And I was on the working group, and just an interesting observation from that is it seems that one of the biggest problems is the end customer. That was a great example you gave of the hospital wanting to do something, but most customers don't actually care how their goods arrive. It's just that they get there.
Yeah.
And it seems that councils only have a few tools that they can actually use, and I think it's mainly parking regulations, access regulations, and air quality regulations, but I might be missing something, so I just wondered if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think partly it's that people don't care, but also partly people don't know and aren't. So I was talking the other day about how when you order your shopping, if you order it from Sainsbury's, you can pick a slot where there's a little green truck next to the slot, and it tells you that a truck's already in your area. And like, but Tesco don't do that. And like, if I'm doing it on Sainsbury's, I'll like order it from Sainsbury's. So I'm like, oh, I can pick a slot when the van's already coming. So I guess there's an element of, actually, if we could inform people better, then maybe they could make better choices, because I think a lot of it is people don't really know. And also people aren't incentivized to make better choices, because next day delivery is often free. So why don't I order my thing to come tomorrow, because it's not costing me anything? Whereas I think there should be more nuance in that. So I ordered something today that I actually do need tomorrow, so I paid more, but I might order something tomorrow that I don't need for 2 weeks, and it doesn't matter. It could come when there is a van coming to the area. So I think a bit more nuance in like consumer choices around deliveries could really help. And then I think finally, the organisational side of things, I think there is, where you can demonstrate the efficiencies, I think people will make choices. So I think kind of almost internal organisational consolidation, so that people aren't, each team isn't ordering their stationery from Amazon to come tomorrow, but actually they're going through a central thing where they order things and then they come, you know, next week. Those organizational things, again, can help to manage the kind of volume of deliveries coming in. So I think, yeah, they'd be more efficient, but I recognize it is really challenging, and you know, most organizations are just doing what's cheapest. But maybe we need a bit more nuance in what's cheapest, and making better behaviours cheaper and less good behaviours more expensive.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I just noticed something before we move on to the next speaker. Kate Samuels, you said something about I'm not quite sure what you mean by this. There are some places that do long deliveries for cheaper.
Yeah, I was just going to say some companies do kind of cheaper delivery if it's one that isn't like next day. So ASOS is an example of one where you can pick like, you know, take like a longer time and it's cheaper. So
yeah,
it's not very common, but it certainly can be done.
Yeah, and Amazon will let you consolidate. You know, if you're ordering 3 different things, they'll say, "Oh, send it in one package." Although they don't always do it. They say it, and you'll click send them all together, and then you'll get 3 different parcels. And you're like, "Why?" Yeah, but no, I think there are some good practice examples out there.
I've had a late flurry of hands, so I'll take them in if they're quick. Ken Haig and Vic McKinley. Ken.
Hi, I'm Ken Haig for the Leave Mouth Rail campaign. My question is, what could be done to incentivise Diageo, one of the largest lorry users, shall we say, in Fife, to take their 70+ lorries off the road on a daily basis? They've got an ideal opportunity to have a rail freight terminal added to the Leave Mouth Rail link, but they seem very reluctant to actually progress it. And that is one thing that would make a major difference to the roadways in Fife, by taking 70+ vehicles per day off the road and very easily moved into rail.
Claire, I appreciate you probably don't
I don't know the local context, but I would imagine one of the barriers would be cost. So maybe there's a case for kind of subsidy or government support there to kind of incentivize that if it's a scheme that, you know, could have a huge benefit, but I don't know the local geography, so I can't comment exactly.
Okay, Vic, if you can be quick and say where you're from, and you're on mute. Vic, we can't hear you.
Right, can you hear me? Yes, Vic McKinney, Edinburgh, LRTA. It'll be necessary for, there's a principle of the polluters pay. Vehicle operators will need to pay. How do you see this affecting costs? And who should make the changes to make this acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big challenge. And, you know, I broadly hinted that, you know, that there is going to be a case for a question arising around whether, you know, you need some kind of road pricing and road user charging. Again, like I mentioned it in terms of kind of leveling the playing field between road and rail, but, you know, it fits into the wider polluter pays principle. But obviously that's highly contentious and yeah, not necessarily politically acceptable. But it's a challenge as well in terms of who pays, because obviously we're living in a cost of living crisis, and, you know, the natural thing for operators to do would be to pass those costs on to consumers. But again, I'd go back to thinking about a bit more nuance in like how people get their goods. So, you know, if you need something very quickly, you might pay more, and if you don't need it so quickly, you might pay less, and that could help to manage some of it. But yeah, I mean, it's a real tricky challenge. I don't necessarily have the answer to, I'm afraid.
Hey, Claire, thank you so much for joining us. That was really interesting, and you can see from the questions what a response you had. That was really, really good.
Thank you for having me.
Obviously, we're all going to have to go away and read this report and others that you've produced. So thanks again. You're welcome to stay on if you want and listen to our next speaker, who is Professor Iain Docherty from the University of Stirling, who comes highly recommended. So Iain, where are you?
Hi Graham, I'm here.
There he is.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I usually say at these events, given the number of advisory roles that I've held most recently as the external member on the Strategic Transport Projects Review Board too, that most of what I'm about to talk about is my fault. Tonight I've been asked to summarise the debate about the 20% target cut in car traffic, and that's something I would like to be my fault because I'm in furious agreement with it. So what I've been asked to do is just sort of spend 5 minutes summarising the debate and why we've got the target and why it's posted the way it is, and then try and stimulate some Q&A that colleagues can go and take away in their write-up. So a 20% target is one of those really great examples of where academic research has begun to influence policy, because it essentially comes from some work that says, if we are going to achieve net zero in time to meet our carbon emission targets, how many zero emissions vehicles can we afford? Now, you might think the answer is as many as we want, because they're zero emissions, but the vehicles themselves and the supply chain that produces them have got a lot of embedded carbon in them. So essentially, the arithmetic tells us that to achieve net zero, we can only have a vehicle fleet which is about a third smaller than the one we've got today. So if you think about how we deliver that over the period to 2045 or before, depending on your interpretation of the targets, we have to get road traffic to start to reduce so we can get to that target of a smaller vehicle fleet in time. So that's really where the 20% number comes from. Second thing to say about research is that there is no plausible net zero future that says we can do this by technology alone. We have to reduce the amount of motorised travel we undertake. So we do need behaviour change as well as technology. And that, of course, even that assumes that the technology that we think will decarbonise the vehicle fleet arrives on time. Even that is uncertain. So the average life of a car is 14 years. 90% of cars registered in the UK last year had fossil fuel engines. So you can see that we will have a car fleet which has a very substantive proportion of fossil fuel engines for some time to come. And that, of course, leaves aside even of some of the more complex questions about whether the supply of the rare earth minerals that we need for the battery technology, et cetera, will be secure. And these are major uncertainties. So we will need behaviour change, which means we will all have to change how we travel around. And in particular, we will all need to travel a bit less. Now, when you talk to people about travelling less, there are some immediate reactions, which I think are worth exploring as well. Now, one of the reasons I think that we find it so difficult to talk about that is because there's an assumption being ingrained that travelling around less or driving less automatically means that our economic output and standard of living will fall. Now, partly that's the policy system's fault, because we've been telling people for at least 60 or 70 years that if you have more transport, your quality of life will get better and the economy will grow. Now, actually, the evidence for that being true is much less persuasive than we would like. And in particular, and this is what I think is really important when we consider travelling less in future, ever since we've started to measure how long people travel around in their lives, and we've done that for more than a century now, we've found that we have a pretty fixed travel time budget. So most people today spend as much time travelling as they did, or their forebears did 100 years ago. And actually, even before the pandemic, we began to see that erode. And particularly for people on higher incomes, they were traveling a little bit less. And that's kind of counterintuitive, but I think it's really important, because what we're saying to people is, we don't want your quality of life to get worse. We want it to get better. And we want you to do the same things you've always done, but just by traveling around a little bit less. And that's a positive message, I think, which is very underplayed so far in the narrative. So, you know, people think about the 20% target as being an imposition on their lives, and it shouldn't be, actually. Then, just to finish, there are some lessons from the pandemic and how we've already changed our behaviour, I think, which are really important, both on the upside and on the downside. And I'm involved in a really big research project with colleagues at the Institute of Transport Studies in Leeds, and we're funded to do a longitudinal study of behaviour in 10 regions across Great Britain, mostly city regions, but some rural areas as well, and half of them are in Scotland. And we're looking at how people have changed their behaviour at different points as the pandemic has played out, and what that means for their future behaviour. So point one is that the level of behaviour change that we saw during the pandemic, although it was imposed, was massive. And we did keep much of the economy running with very much less transport in it. And we're still keeping lots of the economy running with much less transport in it. So car traffic in most places today is still only about 91 or 92% of what it was before March 2020. So on that metric, we've already actually managed to engineer the biggest single fall in the use of the car ever recorded in most places. The downside of that is that overall traffic levels are back to probably above 100% in more places now, precisely because of what's happened in logistics and deliveries and the things you've been talking about thus far. So light van traffic is increased by 1/4 in many places, and HGV traffic is included as well. So what we've done in effect is we've swapped some personal travel for more logistics. So we don't have less traffic, but we've got less car traffic. But nonetheless, we've shown that there is potential to engineer some change there. On the upside, we've learned that actually our digital tools are quite good. So we have meetings like this, they have become commonplace. This makes us more productive and saves carbon. And that will, I think, be really important for many organisations as they move forward. It'll be really interesting to see where hybrid working eventually lands. We still have no idea. It is still too early. There are too many other things going on to have any certainty about what the sort of the new normal, to use that phrase, will be in terms of how people will commute. Interestingly, there is a big debate about the extent to which the pandemic's been a rupture in behaviour or whether it's an accelerant of trends that were already in place. If you look at people's behaviour in terms of commuting to what were ostensibly 5-day-a-week jobs in a single office before the pandemic, there is some evidence from real ticket sales to say that in January 2020, the number of days that people with a season ticket travelled to the office fell below 4 for the first time, not 5, but 4. So we were already seeing quite a change in travel behaviour, and we should expect that, I suppose, to continue. So that's one upside, although there are system level issues to think about there in terms of the cost of people being at home when they're working, etc., etc. The other big upside that we've seen from the pandemic is that we've localised economic activity a lot. And in our research, what we've shown is, and our research is essentially travel diary type work, actually asking people what they're doing. So we have revealed that most people are walking a lot more than they did before. We're not capturing this in the official statistics because of how we count walking. Officially, it's dominated by automatic counting infrastructure that tends to be in city centres and those places that have done worst in terms of footfall and retail sales, etc. During the pandemic. Lots more people are walking, and they're walking in their local communities and their local neighbourhoods, and you can see that in the retail spending statistics and where employment and business activity has moved. Of course, if we localise key service delivery, particularly retailing, there are substantial carbon benefits to be had from that if we design the system properly. So, final couple of things I wanted to say was that I think what the 20% target does, and if you think about what's happened during the pandemic and the clues that might give us to transport and travel behaviour that we'll have over the period when we need to deliver it, is that the key issues are actually the same as they've always been. And we've touched on these in the discussion so far. So the key issue for me is, how much does transport cost and who pays for it? What's the cost differential between modes, and how should the balance between the user and the non-user, i.e. the taxpayer, play out? And I'd say there that whenever you start to change that balance or talk about who pays and how much, people immediately think the status quo is somehow better than whatever you'll change to. The status quo of the transport system is massively inequitable and unfair and economically unproductive in certain respects. And we've actually got a massive opportunity to make it fairer and more sustainable as we move forward to reduce the amount of car traffic we've got. Although that will require pricing, which we may well want to talk about. And finally, we do need to think about the context we're trying to achieve this in. So we are having a cost of living crisis. We have no idea how that's going to play out. We know it's going to hit particular groups of people in particular places hardest. And they, of course, are the people that are least likely to have access to a car now and in future. So we need to think about that. And we also need to, I think, consider where we're coming from in terms of the trajectory. So over the last 10, 15, 20 years, driving a car has got cheaper for most people, in absolute terms for some, and in relative terms for just about all. So perhaps if we weren't in the middle of 11% inflation, we would be able to have a slightly different debate about pricing and who pays. But nonetheless, I think we have to have it, because I can't see any way that we will reach our target for a 20% reduction unless we grasp that particular nettle. And that was all I wanted to say, Graham, to leave plenty of time for questions.
Okay, that's tremendous. Thanks very much, Iain. You used the word fairer. Can you say what you mean by that?
Yeah, so whenever we've had the debate about road pricing, all across the UK, but in Scotland as well, from the Edinburgh charge a few years ago, for example, we always think about how is this fair and what is it going to do to people who depend on their car? You look at the Scottish population, we've still got about a third of people who don't really have access to a car. They tend to be the most vulnerable in society, on the lowest incomes and the most precarious jobs. And if we want to make things fairer, that's the group of people that we need to support and make accessibility easier for, actually, and get them more transport opportunities. So we've got a kind of a misaligned distribution at the moment, where people who don't have access to a car have got residual public transport services in most places, and they're increasingly unreliable. And the people at the top of the income scale have got the most choices and are most subsidised by the public sector, not just through drivers not paying the true cost of their car travel, but of course, that's who tends to use the railways. And the railways, as we're finding out in the current debate, have lots and lots of public subsidy for a relatively small amount of the mobility mix.
Are you more keen on buses than trains?
I'm keen on both. If you want to solve...
Or I should throw in light rail, because James Harkins will if I don't.
I think I said that, there's no credible net zero future where we don't have lots more public transport and less motorised travel overall. We've got quite an extensive railway network, and we need to make it work much harder for us. But even if we were to get a 5% modal shift, and these are pre-pandemic numbers, from road to rail, that would be roughly the equivalent of doubling the passenger numbers that the railways had pre-pandemic. So there is a limit. We've got this infrastructure, we should use it. It's a great economic asset, but it'll only deliver us so much. If we want to really make a difference in terms of reaching the target, we've got to do two things. Supply more public transport quickly, and that tends to mean the bus, because you can deliver that quickly. And it also means travelling less by motorised modes overall.
Okay, right, I'm going to bring in some speakers. I am going to start with Mark Ruskell, and then I'm going to go to Tom Flanagan. Mark.
Thanks, Graham. I'm not sure if I can turn my video or not. Oh, here we go. Not great bandwidth here. Yeah, thanks for that, Iain. I want to ask you about rural areas, because the STPR is pretty focused on the three big cities. There's not a lot in there for rural. There's not a lot of capital infrastructure proposed for rural areas. What do you see as the solutions for rural areas? Or is it a case of saying, well, we're not going to get 20% vehicle mileage reductions from people living in remote parts of the Highlands or even the Central Belt, so we should just wholly focus on the cities? Where do you see rural Scotland sitting in all of this?
So the first thing to say is that most people that live in rural Scotland actually live in small towns. And small towns are the ideal 20-minute neighbourhoods. So the potential to shift actually quite a lot of transport to the active modes from the car is pretty strong in a lot of what we might think of as rural Scotland. In deep rural areas, that's clearly not the case. And I think part of the bargain, as it were, between capital investment in the major cities, or the other side of that equation, is that we do have to subsidise, I think, and make it much easier for people to have access to zero emission road vehicles in rural Scotland. We're never going to have public transport that serves many of the deepest, most remotest communities, most remote communities that we have, to the extent that on-demand road vehicles will do. I know that's not always a popular view, and it's not a unanimous one, but I think that rural Scotland actually is where we should go first with support for electrifying the car fleet as best we can, especially now as range anxiety is much less of an issue with modern vehicles. And if we get our sharing of them correct, something else that's been set back by the pandemic for obvious reasons, we should be able to make quite a big difference there. But most people in rural Scotland live in small towns, and most of the behaviour change we're talking about is actually reasonably applicable to most people, not all, but most people across the country.
Mm-hmm.
You want to come back on that, Mark?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, obviously the 20% is a, you're saying that's backed up by the kind of science of what we need to do to tackle climate change and get congestion levels down. But do you see a kind of variable level? So would you expect that we could get even greater modal shifts, say in the centre of Edinburgh, 30, 40%, maybe more, but then we might be looking at a kind of stickier 5, 10% in other parts of Scotland? Is that acceptable? Is that manageable? Can we predict that? Can we predict the areas that are going to always be difficult, and then really accelerate the areas where there's just so many choices and there's nowhere to park anyway, so you might as well just get on a tram or whatever?
Yes, I fully agree with that. I think that's exactly what we need to do. STPR2 hints at that. Let's see what the delivery plan and the subsequent stages of that after the consultation analysis reports actually says. The parts of Scotland that worry me most in this agenda actually are not our rural communities, because I think the absolute level of mobility is relatively small because the population is sparse. I think we will be able to serve those by cleaner road vehicles. The parts of the country that really worry me are those fringe urban, suburban areas that have been built over the last 10, 20, 30 years that have very poor public transport access, and have got people who are used to doing almost everything in their lives by car, even if they don't have to. So, at the risk of a stereotype, it's the suburban or ex-urban house with a monoblock driveway with 2 and a bit cars and absolutely no retail or public services within active travel distance of it. And that's where a lot of the population lives. That's going to be really hard to crack. And the politics of doing that are going to be really difficult, because they are the constituency, to use that word, who are going to feel change the most difficult in many respects, not necessarily more rural communities.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Tom Flanagan, followed by Andrew Lindsay. Tom, you're from Transform Scotland.
Yeah, I'm volunteer with Transform Scotland. Thanks, Graham. And thanks, Iain, for explaining the 20% target. I think it's very positive to have that national target, because local authorities haven't used the tools they have at their disposal to implement demand management measures over the years. And one of the demand management measures that they've actually perversely been applying is subsidising car parking spaces in town and city centres. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts about withdrawing the ability of local authorities to subsidise car parking spaces, because they seem to see it as a competitive advantage. And we all know there's no such thing as a free car parking space. Somebody pays for it, and that somebody is usually us as the ratepayer. So I'm just wondering, as part of the demand management strategy that's about to come forward, whether you'd support withdrawing the ability to make perverse decisions around demand management.
Yeah, I'm all in favour of rational solutions, Tom. I think most of us are. So I guess I would be. What I would say is that, again, this is where the politics of this gets really difficult. So the local government structure of Scotland's a mess. It was designed, frankly, for reasons of gerrymandering, and it causes all kinds of issues about what happens around the fringes of particularly Edinburgh and Glasgow, but also Dundee. And we've created perverse incentives in the planning system to put things in the wrong place, particularly retail developments. And what I would say is that, again, I think it's really important that we go after the polluter and make them pay. And we should make the people that pollute the most pay the most. So if I look around the big cities and look at the acreage of car parking that we've got for major out-of-town retail developments that, frankly, we don't need anymore, I think that's a kind of more important problem to crack than whether Edinburgh City Council has subsidised parking on Christmas Sundays. But I do realise that that's really difficult politically, because guess who the swing constituencies are and where they're located and what kind of people they are. And this is the debate that we always have in transport economics about, whether we get the pricing right and who is it that's going to pay. And my personal view is we will not meet our climate targets. We will not get to the 75% reduction by 2030. We will not get to 100%. And we will not get 20% car kilometre reduction unless we get pricing right for a change. And I do not envy the politicians that are having to sell that message, because it does mean that some people are going to have to pay more to do what they have traditionally done and what they want to do. But I cannot see a land of milk and honey where that is not required. So yes, let's have a diversity of pricing tools as well. Workplace parking levy, out-of-town retail parking levy, per kilometre charge. We need all of these things actually in the long run. And interestingly, we're going to need them very quickly, because at some point before too long, somebody in the Treasury is going to think that that fuel tax revenue that used to be coming in is being eroded rather too quickly, because the number of cars that we've got is declining.
Good. Well, it's not good. I'll have to keep you two with your mad parking ideas away from South Lanarkshire. Andrew Lindsay, and then Jim Densham.
Thanks, Ian. I was going to speak about the kind of the political side of things, and you kind of covered a little bit about what I was going to ask, and mainly my point, I guess, is that we kind of all know what we need to do to reach the 20% limit, but time and time again, when we're trying to have conversations about how to get that done, it is the political will of politicians to actually kind of be brave enough to stand up and say, listen, we need to get this done. We know it's unpopular. We know you're not going to like it, but we actually need to get this done for the better of everyone. And so my question to you is really, how do you see a movement towards politicians going to there? How do we get to the point where we can convince politicians that actually it is the best thing to do, to actually be brave enough to stand up? And I'm talking about local politicians as well as the kind of national politicians. And I was just thinking, like, what in your view is the best way to do that, other than, we can brief them all we want, but eventually it has to come to a point where, change happens in that respect.
I wish I knew the answer to that in many respects, Andrew, because if I did, I could tour the world telling people how to do it, because there is such a demand for it. You're right to say that none of this is rocket science. And this is the thing, I think, which really irritates a lot of us in the transport research world, is actually we know how to fix these problems. The tools are all there, and actually they don't need to be lots of technology. If we had some more white paint and straight lines and then lettering that said bus lane, that would do a lot of the work for us. And none of that is particularly 21st century technology. Contrast that with the other big decarbonisation problem we've got in Scotland, which is domestic heating and cooling. And frankly, we have no idea how to do that. The technology to decarbonise domestic heating does not exist. So we genuinely don't know how to do that. We do know how to decarbonise transport. Therefore, there is a collective responsibility on us in the transport sector, I think, to say that, be honest about it, and try to have some of these debates you've spoken about. Positively, what do we know about how change happens? We know that from transport psychology work, we know that when people are convinced of the health benefits to them as individuals, either through reduced exposure to pollution or by being more active, they tend to be very supportive of moves to change the balance between modes. We know that younger people are much more likely to be able to do without a car, if that's the right way of putting it, and are supportive of moves to rebalance modes. And we also know that, and what's happened in London in particular with the low traffic neighbourhoods during the pandemic is really interesting here. And there's some fascinating political science work being done about the local election results in different boroughs in London and comparing them to how much LTN action there's been. The lobby against these changes is extremely well organised and extremely vocal. It's often a smaller minority than we think. And I think what you're beginning to see in the cities and the desire to reduce traffic for health reasons and for safety reasons is the way in. So it's about saying to people that, actually, this will not make you worse off. It will make you happier. It will make you healthier. And your local shop is more likely to survive. There's a much more positive way into the debate than saying we're going to charge you £2 to park at Asda, which is how we've traditionally sort of framed the narrative. Don't underestimate how difficult that is for the politicians. And I always like to say, naive though I know this is, when I have an audience of politicians to speak to, please not another set of leaflets about parking charges at the local supermarket when you want my vote for the election. I think if I went to find my pile of every single party's literature here, I could have found at least one example of that from last month.
Oh, you must pass that on. Right, I'm going to go to Jim Densham from Cycling UK. We've only got a few minutes left. Off you go, Jim.
Yeah, thanks very much. So Cycling UK's response to the consultation was that there was lots of great carrots, encouraging ways to get people to use alternatives, but there wasn't enough sticks, ways to get people out of their cars. And obviously you talked about road user charging or, road pricing. So in that case, but they sort of kick that down the road a bit to look at a study and perhaps talk to UK government. In a way, we need to get on with that as soon as possible, because I presume it would take a long time to bring in. There would be a lot of technology needed. So are there any examples in other countries where road user charging has been done to any extent? How long would it take to bring in? Is there any evidence on that?
That's a tricky one, because the technology about how you do pricing has changed a lot, and it's become a lot better recently. So it depends on the political appetite to introduce a scheme. The two lessons of road pricing, which are really interesting, are about understanding who it is that pays and why. So the reason that the congestion charge in London was a success was that Livingston, when he became late, when he was pitching to be mayor, actually, because it was before he was elected, very early on realised that none of the people that he was trying to convince as marginal voters would actually pay the charge, because nobody drives into central London, right? So what he realised was that actually he was politically insulated from that. So that was clever. People in Edinburgh did not understand that in the Edinburgh congestion charging referendum, nor did people in Manchester in their referendum. The other example, which is often quoted, is Stockholm, where the scheme was introduced and then the referendum was about whether to take it away or not. And it's still there for obvious reasons, that they invested in really high quality public transport and people could see the benefits. So again, it takes some political will, but it also takes some planning and some foresight on this. What I would say about charging in future is, though, government needs the revenue. I talk about the UK government here because it's all reserved. The Treasury is going to have a panic about road taxation as a revenue source. And it's going to have a kind of Wile E. Coyote moment where it thinks road user charging is 10 years away. It's been 10 years away for at least 40 years. And it will be 10 years away until it's coming next week. Because when government decides it needs to fill that financial black hole, it will move really, really quickly. What worries me about that is whenever a scheme is designed in a hurry, it will be a badly thought through scheme and it will have all kinds of unintended consequences. And in the Scottish environment, to come back to the question about rural Scotland from Mark earlier on, if there was a single GB or UK-wide pricing scheme that was a per kilometre charge, that would do horrendous things to many local communities in rural Scotland. So we have to make sure that whatever charge comes in, and this is not, whether it ends up being a devolved or a reserved or a mixed function, the scheme design has got to be appropriate to our conditions.
Okay, right. Jane, you're going to be the last questioner. Keep it brief, please.
Thanks. I'm worried about what's in the pipeline already, because we've got dual systems, we have got embedded in plans, relief roads and the like, which have been approved by the Scottish Government. And we know that this sort of scheme increases traffic, induced traffic, I think they call it. How do we marry that up with what we have to do, which you have outlined so clearly?
So this is where I get into trouble from my sustainable transport colleagues. Sorry, Colin. I'm much less worried about new road infrastructure and induced demand than most people, simply because of the arithmetic. It's such a tiny, 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 tiny proportion of the demand we've already got. It's not important. What is important is the opportunity cost of what we're not spending the money we spend on building roads on. What could we be doing with it in terms of better public transport and better public realm, etc. But induced traffic, not that big an issue. If you want to think about induced traffic, where has the biggest source of induced traffic in the economy come from in the last 10 years? Roughly equivalent to about 10 or 15% increase in traffic levels beyond or comparison with what we had before. And the answer is the sat nav in your car and on your phone. Because what it's done is opened up all that network of minor roads that you never knew existed. And in effect, we've built a much bigger new road network and infrastructure than any motorway programme ever, just because of the technology and sat-navs. So in terms of new road schemes, it's totally marginal in my view.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for that, Iain. Thanks for all the questions, folks. Really good, as ever. And I see various views in the chat. We should say, of course, that it's Scottish Bus Week this week, which will delight Ralph Roberts, no doubt, and others. And I also noticed that Rona Gibb is telling us that it's the National Active Travel Conference at Perth Concert Hall on the 14th of June. I'm actually still waiting for my invite for that, but maybe it will come through. You never know. Our next task is to pull together a report, hopefully with some recommendations based on our sessions that we've had so far. I'll speak to Colin and the MSPs who are on the group about that. So we'll do that over the summer, and we will also work out our next programme, which will be after the Parliament's summer recess. So if anyone has any thoughts on what we could be looking at next, please just email and we can consider them, and then we'll get a programme of meetings up and running after the summer. Colin Howden, do you want to say anything before we finish?
No, I think that's a decent summary of where we go after this. Does Marie want to say anything? Because Marie's been organising the CPG, not me. Unmute.
Marie.
Oh, Marie's being shy for once. So no, I think that's a good summary, Graham. I'm happy with where we've left that.
Good. Well, if you're happy, I'm happy, Colin. I think with that, I'll just thank everyone for attending, and we'll see you after the summer, and hopefully it'll be in person. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.